Radio 4, now at exactly 10:15, time for our Sunday feature, presented by Frank Gillard, who looks at some of the changes brought about in British society by the Second World War. No going back.
What the Second World War did, if you like, is concentrate the mind. It really said, we've got to have a completely fresh start, so let's get all these ideas together that are bubbling around and try and put them in one monumental reconstruction.
It was horrific for people, lots of people were killed, but I think people did feel if we only stick in there, what we're really fighting for is a better world.
This was, in a very real sense, a people's war. There was a kind of an alliance between the soldier in the field and the civilian at home, that they weren't going to have all the misery and suffering and danger wasted in the peace. They were going to win the peace too.
I think in the Second World War, people look back to the 1930s and the Depression, and there's a very strong sense that we must not go back to that.
Frank Gillard, veteran BBC war correspondent, looks at the changes brought about in British society by the Second World War in No Going Back.
For myself, as one now in his 9th decade, who lived through that profound and testing climacteric of our history, I see World War II as the great watershed of my own life and a very considerable watershed in British social history. Every echo of 1945 delivers the same message. It was to be a people's peace, a time for change, a time for communality and universality, time for more mutual concern and fairer shares. A message arising sometimes out of reasoned argument, sometimes in heated debate, sometimes in threatening challenge. Gunner Spike Milligan.
I remember being on the stage in an army show, and one of the comics there said to all the front row officers, "It's our bloody turn now. Your lot's out and my lot's in." Like this, there's a great cheer went up, and you realise where it was at.
But who was to lead the nation in this great drive, this crusade for a brave new Britain? Winston Churchill had every reason to expect that he would be the people's choice. On the day when victory in Europe was proclaimed and public euphoria knew no bounds, his reception by the Whitehall crowds was utterly rapturous.
In all our long history, we have never seen a greater day than this. Man or woman, has done their bit. Neither the long years, nor the dangers, nor the fierce attacks of the enemy have in any way weakened the unbending resolve of the British nation.
But that wholehearted, sincere, and unprecedented demonstration of acclaim could be misinterpreted. It was a heartfelt explosion of gratitude for the past, rather than a vote of confidence for the future. When the votes came to be counted, the Labour Party had a massive overall majority of 149. The great wartime leader, gallant in personal defeat, left Downing Street, handing over the stupendous responsibility of heading the advance into Britain's New Jerusalem to the modest, unassuming, unexciting, and almost deliberately uncharismatic Clement Attlee.
We want more houses, clothes, household goods, coal, machinery, in fact, every kind of thing. And there's only one way to get these things, and that is by work, by utilizing every resource of inventiveness, organization, and scientific knowledge, and by all, whether managers or wage and salary earners, doing our best.
Indeed, the post-war government faced a situation of the utmost grimness and severity. Britain was in economic chaos. Barbara Castle.
Nobody who was too young to live through that period has any idea what it was like to have an empty coffer and to have your ally, the United States, who've been keeping you going for their own sake make munitions for them as well as for us. The United States suddenly cut off the supplies.
The life support machine.
The life support machine. The ships in mid-Atlantic, after the declaration of peace, were full of material which were free when they left the American coast, and we had to pay for them by the time they arrived. Congress just abolished Lend-Lease, and we no money.
On top of all this, hundreds of thousands of private homes and public buildings were destroyed or gravely damaged, and there was hardly a house in the land which was not in need of some repair and renovation.
The major problem I remember as a young MP, particularly in 45 to 49, was housing. And as the lads came home, and they wanted to resume their married life or start it, and the misery of living with in-laws, you know, was something they couldn't tolerate. And as an MP, all my political surgery problems were about housing. Housing was the thing. Let us have our little corner together. We've been in NAFI's canteens, we've been in soldiers' barracks. We want a home. We want privacy, and we want ourselves.
Professor Arthur Marwick of the Open University.
You had a terrible problem in 1939, and you had an absolutely disastrous problem in 1945. And I don't think the Labour government covered itself in glory. I think they should have done more, but they did have a big problem. There was this consciousness that we must do something, we must make things better. And this spirit of reconstruction, this heightened consciousness, is represented, for instance, by the Federation of British Industry, who actually said, bombs have made builders of us all.
So housing was given top priority. But meanwhile, the determination to reform and recondition our society was unshaken and undeterred. The Churchill coalition government, in the very thick of war, had evolved several major blueprints for the advancement of post-war Britain. The first, produced in 1942, bore the name of Sir William Beveridge, who presided over an official interdepartmental committee of top civil servants. It set out a range of proposals to shield every citizen from poverty, sickness and unemployment, and provide freedom from want, disease, ignorance and idleness. Beveridge addressed the nation over the BBC in his rather formal style.
The security plan has three sides to it. It includes, first, a scheme of all-in social insurance for cash benefits. It includes, second, a general scheme of children's allowances. It includes, third, an all-in scheme of medical treatment of every kind for everybody.
In a broadcast of March the 23rd, 1943, the Prime Minister went on to set out his vision of post-war life in Britain. Along with tens of thousands of men of the 8th Army, I listened to him on shortwave during a sandstorm in the western desert of North Africa.
Here is a real opportunity in what I once called bringing the magic of averages to the rescue of the millions. Therefore, you must rank me and my colleagues as strong partisans of national compulsory insurance for all classes, for all purposes, from the cradle to the grave.
The impact of that broadcast on army morale was immediate and very marked. We began to see that this was a war of social purpose. The sacrifices it demanded would bear fruit, and they did. By 1946, the National Insurance and National Health Acts were on the statute book. So was the Housing Act. The Town and Country Planning Act was in force by 1947, and the National Assistance Act and the Children's Act by 1948. Meanwhile, major industries were progressively being nationalised to secure government control of what Nye Bevan called the commanding heights of the economy. By the end of 1948, in spite of all the problems arising from the war, Britain was a firmly established welfare state. But the war's influence extended well beyond material things. Geoffrey Richards, reader in history at the University of Lancaster.
The Second World War was an enormous high point for the arts in Britain. And this was because they occupied a particular emotional role in wartime, which they don't, I think, in peacetime. They were seen as embodying the spirit of the nation, of our heritage, of why we fight, of the thing which distinguished us from the enemy. civilization against barbarism. And this was recognised by the government, which in 1940 set up a body called CIMA.
CIMA, the Council for the Encouragement of Music and the Arts, took plays, art exhibitions, operas and ballets around the country, bringing the arts to the people as never before, despite the wartime conditions, and finding much appreciation.
In 1940, 80 exhibitions were staged for 300,000 visitors who were brought to paintings in a way that they hadn't been before. The Ballet Rambert, the Old Vic Company, the Sadler's Wells Opera Company were playing in village halls and town halls. Chamber music was being played in factory canteens. It was high-quality artistic work being brought to the people.
Artists themselves found the war a stimulus. Sir Stephen Spender.
Both wars, oddly enough, have been great periods for visual art in England. If you go to the Imperial War Museum and look at the paintings that were done in the First World War, they're a very, very high point in English art. And the Second World War also, there were very high standards through, as I say, Henry Moore and Graham Sutherland. It's as though English painters go to sleep between wars. They have to have a big pin stuck in their behinds or something in order to wake up and look at things.
Sir Stephen saw in the great theatrical productions of the time strong links with the nation's past and a sense of heritage and continuity which carried an assurance for our future even in the darkest hours.
Combined with this hope of a new world, there was also a great revival of the idea of England. I mean, for instance, in the theatre, Peggy Ashcroft and John Gielgud and Olivier, all those actors were really the most marvellous expression of the spirit of England during the war. In fact, it always seems to me that when Churchill says the Battle of Britain was England's finest hour, that this really links up with Henry V and the idea of a Shakespearean England.
We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother, be he ne'er so base. And gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap, while Denny speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's Day.
Henry V was inspired by the Ministry of Information, who wanted a film based on England's heroic past, based on Shakespeare, and based on our culture and our heritage. And so it exactly corresponds with the promotion of classical music and art and so on as a symbol of civilization. And Olivier embraced it wholeheartedly and produced what has become a classic film. And all this is part of the popularization of something which came to be seen as symbolically very significant. As in all things, I think, the cinema is very much a mirror of popular moods and popular attitudes. And the Second World War was the war in which the cinema was a major element, and that writing was no longer as prominent or as significant as it had been in the First War. So that although people like Keith Douglas and so on are now known as young war poets of the Second World War, they never achieved the celebrity of people like Wilfred Owen and the equivalents of the First World War. We'd become a much more visual culture already than a literary culture.
The post-war government, in spite of the general state of austerity in Britain, was generously inclined towards the arts. In 1946, CIMA was turned into the Arts Council, the arm of the government for dispensing public funds to the arts.
It was terribly important to us that we shouldn't just get drowned in the details and grim details of economic survival. We should hold out an image of the sort of country we wanted to build, and it should have fun in it and colour, and above all, artistic expression. I think it helped people to see beyond the immediate struggles to the day when we should have a life not only more secure, but more full of creative things.
With the implementation of the 1944 Butler Education Act, another of the blueprints for the future, the whole educational world was now dramatically caught up in this great adventure of post-war social advance. Professor Ted Wragg Director of Education at the University of Exeter, recalled how the Education White Paper of 1944 set out the aims behind the revolutionary new proposals.
What it actually says is that education should really secure for children a happier childhood and a better start in life, that it should ensure a fuller measure of education and opportunity for young people, and provide means for all of developing the various talents with which they're endowed, so enriching the inheritance of the country whose citizens they are.
It was the decision that secondary education should be provided for every child and should be free that was most welcomed. It was a great step forward from the pre-war days.
Most children at that time would go to a local all-age school in a village or a town, and they'd go there from the age of 5 through to 14. And they would effectively be getting a primary school education. So they probably wouldn't do any or very much science. It's highly unlikely they'd learn a foreign language. I mean, all the things that are taken for granted nowadays in secondary education were the privilege of a minority.
So now in the post-war age, there was to be secondary education for all in the secondary modern schools, the technical schools, and the grammar schools. As for higher education, including the polytechnics, Churchill had declared the need for greatly increased provision in that broadcast of his back in 1943.
No one who can take advantage of a higher education should be denied its chance. You cannot conduct a modern community except with an adequate, nay, an ample supply of persons upon whose education, whether humanitarian, technical, or scientific, much time and money has been spent.
What happened in 1943-44 was, first of all, that people realized the enormous talents that many young soldiers had demonstrated. These were people who perhaps had a very rudimentary education, not beyond the elementary school level. They get into the army or the air force or whatever, they learn to handle complicated machinery, to take responsibility. They acquire all kinds of skills, and then when they leave the army and go out, they often go on to quite responsible jobs. So people then look back at that and say, look at all those talented people. You know, why weren't they brought out properly at school? Hence this notion of developing the various talents which had become so apparent during the war.
But the years immediately following the war were still years of austerity and shortage. Professor Wragg was a young schoolboy at the time.
I remember that we had to use paper over and over again. We had to use it right in the margins. We couldn't throw anything away. Suddenly, around about 45, 46, when I was 7, 8 and so on, I started getting an exercise book of my own, which was on rather nice paper. And I think even as a child I felt that things were picking up here.
It was not until well into the 50s that paper came fully off the ration, and the acute shortage of newsprint during the ration years hit the press very severely. The popular dailies were down to 4 pages per issue, 6 pages to the more expensive quality papers. This acute restriction affected newspaper style very considerably, and it opened up major opportunities for another medium, broadcasting, as Lord Briggs, the BBC's historian, points out.
The BBC, of course, benefited from the fact that newspapers really were rationed in size, and also newspapers were not able to deal consequently with problems in any depth, so the BBC had the opportunity of being an informing force which could provide you with news very early, and also being, if you like, an interpretive force, because it could really get more involved in analysing issues than the newspapers could at the time.
Our war in broadcasting was a war of spoken words. Radio was the essential broadcasting service of the war years and of the immediate post-war period. Television's time had not yet come. For wartime news coverage, BBC Radio developed and heavily exploited the medium of sound recording for on-the-spot reporting. All the recording was done on disc, tape recording was still virtually unknown. During the early war years, the sheer bulk of our equipment made it impossible for war reporters to get our microphones right up to the forward areas of the fighting. But when we landed in Normandy, we were equipped with newly developed portable disc recorders. They were cumbersome, clumsy, fragile, unreliable. Each of them weighed 40 pounds, but through them we could bring vivid sound pictures of the battles day by day right to the home fireside.
BBC, this is Frank Gillard here, recording just outside Chile mile or two back from Tilly, on Friday morning, June the 16th, during a barrage which is being laid down to prepare the way for an infantry attack on a small village just to the east of Tilly. In this barrage, we've got our 4.2-inch mortars, our field guns, our medium guns, all the guns of the fleet. The shells are whistling overhead now. Just listen to them.
Broadcast news had really not amounted to much in the 20s and 30s, but the war, with the development of mobile recording, rapidly brought radio to full flower as a journalistic medium. Asa Briggs.
Well, there was a basic change in the whole pattern of communications during the war, and it had great long-term significance. First of all, there was a passion for news, and during the 1930s, I don't think there had been the same passion for news. You wanted to know what was happening on every front. The BBC increased in a dramatic way the number of its news bulletins, and the 9 o'clock news bulletin on Sunday night in particular, which was followed by a postscript which dealt with policy, was listened to by millions of people. It was almost for them the central event of the week.
In magazine journalism, the outstanding publication of the war and the post-war years was Picture Post, an illustrated weekly of a new and different kind, which made a timely first appearance in 1938, and which very soon was making a great impact with its sharply alert and penetrating text and its new style of photojournalism. Its illustrations replaced the old-style posed photographic portraits so familiar up to that time in illustrated magazines with revealing action snapshots, accompanied by irreverent, lively, shrewd captions in the style of the articles concerned. Picture Post's policy was left-of-centre, inquisitive, inquiring, socially concerned, constantly challenging authority. Tom Hopkinson, its editor.
I remember on the day of the election I'd been asked to go to a party at Grosvenor House, and as the results kept coming up on the board, it was naturally a very ministerial, high army and important people at the party. As the results kept coming up showing Labour gain, somebody strode across to me and said to me, "It's your bloody Picture Post that's responsible for this." And I said, "Oh, don't give us all the credit. The bloody Daily Mirror deserves a share of this."
Picture Post is an extraordinarily interesting example of what the new communications meant. It had pictures and words. In a sense, it's pre-television. The pictures really are there, the kind of pictures you would see in television later on. The words are really very forceful words. It is a social critic as a periodical. And I think it really had a very considerable amount of influence.
Paper rationing cramped Picture Post just as it hit every newspaper and journal. Regrettable though this restriction was, it was one of the lesser shortages which we all had to bear. Food, fuel, petrol, clothing were all on coupons. In 1947, even bread had to be rationed to release food for starving populations in devastated Europe. John Strachey, the food minister, broke the ghastly news in a broadcast.
There's a limit, a strict limit, to what Britain can do to help the starving people. And that limit has undoubtedly been reached. It's been reached at the point at which we have to make all preparations for bread and flour rationing.
When bread was rationed, I think that was really the hardest of all, because bread was your mainstay of a family. You could always, if the meal wasn't big enough, you could always have bread. But when bread came in rations, you cut down a meal by half, because you had nothing else to take its place.
We found it bitterly ironic that in victory, after all our wartime sacrifices, we were now, 2 years after the end of the war, more severely in the grip of rationing than ever before. But no matter who else went hungry, the young were still looked after. Churchill had led the way in his 1943 broadcast.
Yeah, let me say, there's no finer investment for any community than putting milk into babies. Healthy citizens are the greatest asset any country can have.
Food rationing went on for some years and it was terribly tight. But cod liver oil and orange juice for the kids, free, came absolutely first. And I remember Nairn Bevan as Minister of Health saying once, if you want to see where the wealth of Britain is in this post-war world, look in the perambulators. And they were some of the bonniest babies we'd ever had, because the nation's priorities were directed to them.
As the Butler Act came into force, children of school age were also included in this category for special provision.
The introduction of school meals and milk meant that at least children got a basic minimum. They had one hot meal, they had a bottle of milk, and so they had calcium and some balance in their diet, whatever happened to them the rest of the day. And also the poorer ones could get small grants for clothing, school uniform, even for shoes. Charities had done this kind of work before, but for the state to actually consider providing it was novel. And I think it achieved a great deal. It brought the country generally up to a higher level of health and turnout.
It was not the fault of our farmers that food was in such short supply. Agricultural historian Professor Howard Newby.
The Second World War ushered in, I think, what we can fairly call a second agricultural revolution, a revolution that was as extensive as the first one in the 18th century. And like the one in the 18th century, it was partly based on new technology. It began before the war, when tractors and the early combine harvesters were being brought in, but only very slowly and in very small numbers. Horse and hand technology on the farm still holds sway. And then we saw a massive reorganization during the war. We had the introduction of the Wraggs, the War Agricultural Executive Committees, which organized farming in their area. We saw the pooling of machinery, and we saw a wholesale technological revolution involving machinery, fertilizer, and management on farms.
Arthur Court, a Somerset grassland farmer, was ordered to plough up his land and grow potatoes and sugar beet. He had no experience of such crops and no suitable equipment, but his Wragg kept a machinery pool and he could hire what he wanted. Then some of his acres had to be turned over to arable production.
We started off growing grain by buying a second-hand binder to cut the crop. It all had to be harvested, stooped, stacked, and it didn't take a fool to build a corn stack, Frank. You know, none of us knew anything about building corn stacks, so a lot of them fell over, and a great many of them had props up against them. But we learnt the hard way.
The Wraggs, the War Agricultural Executive Committees, had enormous powers. They could direct farmers how to farm their land, and they could even remove farmers from their land if they were felt to be not up to the mark. In practice, that power was used very sparingly, but the threat was there, and the threat proved effective in actually making agriculture far more efficient than it had ever been before the war.
I remember going across Salisbury Plain. I was building up a pedigree herd in 1939. I drove across to Basingstoke to a farm sale, and acres and acres of land right across the Hampshire and the Wiltshire Plain were simply covered with docks and ragwort up to your waist. It was absolutely derelict, and yet, you see, within 2 or 3 years of the war, that was growing satisfactory crops of cereals.
So in 1945, the kind of agriculture we had in this country was very, very different to the kind of agriculture we had in 1939. And then, because there was a determination not to go back, that was continued in 1947 with the Agriculture Act, which essentially continued the kind of wartime support for agriculture which we'd seen, and carried that on over the next 40 years.
The agricultural revolution was driven forward by scientific discovery and practice.
There was tremendous inputs from the scientists, you know, all through the war. I mean, I remember that the varieties they talked about were mostly Dutch and French varieties of wheat when we started to increase our production of cereals. And then they brought in higher yielding varieties. Then they increased the fertilizer, because the old varieties that we started with during the war wouldn't stand any amount of fertilizer, because it could just go down flat if you put on the amount of fertilizer we do today. You see, the straw was long, designed for thatching, originally, you see, bred for thatching. Then they started to say we must get shorter strawed wheats, so the scientist, the plant breeder, got busy with breeding shorter strawed wheats, and now we have dwarf wheat varieties, which only grows about 2'6" high.
Professor Marwick considers that war tends to lead not so much to scientific discovery as to the exploitation of scientific discoveries.
The Second World War opened up the possibility, forced us to develop electronics, aviation, and motor cars. In 1945, there was a marvelous advance on our position in 1939. The First World War was the chemists' war, the Second World War was the physicists' war. And the spin-off from this is quite incredible, particularly, oddly enough, in the area of medicine. Medical physics was given an enormous boost by the experience and experiments of the Second World War. So that is one colossally important area.
Penicillin was a case in point. Sir Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin in 1928, but it remained in the laboratory stage until the war, when there was an urgent need for effective agents to fight bacterial infection in war wounds. This brought penicillin at once into urgent demand, and from 1940 onwards it assumed a dominant role and led to the healing of wounds and the saving of life on an enormous scale. Sir Alexander spoke in a BBC broadcast of the further research this prompted.
Workers all over the world have been stimulated to investigate the products of the thousands of other molds and other lowly members of the vegetable kingdom to see whether something better can be found. And no doubt there will be others, for there are still hundreds of molds and bacteria to be investigated. One infection in particular is occupying much attention, that is tubercle. There are glimmerings of hope, and it is just possible that from the research which has been stimulated by penicillin there will come a remedy for this dreadful scourge. Penicillin has started a new line of research, and we cannot yet foretell all the advantages which may come of it. And already we have many benefits, and we can hope for many more.
That further research eventually produced streptomycin, which largely conquered tuberculosis in Britain. We now live in a virtually TB-free age, thanks to research stimulated and activated by the emergency of war. Lord Swann, a biologist switched amazingly in wartime to radar studies, points to a less obvious but still extremely important scientific development which carried over with great effect into peacetime.
I doubt if radar would have developed nearly as fast as it subsequently did, or all the associated technologies, had it not been for the war. But I think what was really significant was the conception that by doing what came to be called operational research, you could actually make things work a lot better. And as I said, that applied to radar, and it applied to all sorts of things that the army did. And the idea that you could get hold of a lot of scientists, many of whom weren't trained in the actual specialities in question, and get them to do useful research into how things worked and how things can be made to work better in highly complicated situations, gradually grew up. And there's no doubt at all, I think, that that ultimately speeded up operational research in the whole business industrial world.
So the war caused the disciplined clinical methods of the laboratory to be applied to the office, the workbench, the factory, the farm, the production line, the distribution systems, and most important of all, to the workers, pushing aside the old haphazard practices of pre-war times.
There was a feeling that this is pretty dramatic, that, people can help with something as complicated and difficult and peculiar as warfare. And if you can make a contribution there, you can surely make an even better contribution to a peaceful society.
From then on, there was a much greater government willingness to put money into scientific research. Other changes arising from the war were, of course, much more obvious. The new role of women in everyday life, for example.
You haven't thought of industry, I suppose. I don't want to go in a factory, if that's what you mean. There's nothing to be afraid of in a factory. Mr. Bevan needs another 1 million women, you know. And I don't think we should disappoint him at a time like this. But the men at the front need tanks, guns, and planes. You can help your country just as much in an overall as you can in uniform these days.
In the cinema, films such as Millions Like Us reflected this change. Edna Healey recognized that this was a turning point.
For the first time, women realized that they could take an independent job, be financially independent. They didn't rely on their husbands. They had to look after the family while the husband was away. And this made this fundamental change in our society, which I think is more important than people have realized and goes deeper.
We saw it as a great liberation for women. You may not think it's much of a liberation to be in the ATS or to be in a munition work, but women were wanted for their own sake as workers. They weren't appendages of a man. They were needed and required, and attention had to be paid to the kind of conditions they wanted.
Women were given an unprecedented opportunity to show what every sensible person already knew, that women were utterly and completely the equals of men, and it was only prejudice which resisted this. It was always very difficult for women to demonstrate this. The war gave them the opportunity. I think the biggest change was with respect to married women. It had been an assumption before 1939 that married women, except in the cotton industry in Lancashire, did not work.
When I talk to teachers nowadays, younger teachers, about this, they can't believe there ever was a time when if you got married you had to quit teaching, but women did, and it was the 44 Act that actually gave them the right to stay in teaching.
World War II brought married women into very vital occupations. The old idea that they'd be rushing off to change the nappies of their kids at the drop of a hat was wiped out.
Even so, not many women were returned to the Commons, even in 1945.
No, we did have the largest number so far of women. I think it was 21. But you're quite right. There still was this terrific male assumption, absolutely instinctive, that, of course, if two people applied for a job, other things being equal, you chose the man. I mean, it was just the law of nature, you know. And one had to fight that. And men would say to you, oh, I think you make a wonderful MP, Barbara, but you see, women won't vote for women, which, of course, was the biggest canard.
But did the war set off a revolution in sexual behaviour?
There was certainly a breakdown of many of the old restraints. The relations between the sexes, in a sense, became a great deal more open. The war, I think, really was quite an important period in relation to the development of contraception. And also, I think, at the end of the war, these themes affected the way in which you viewed the future. You really felt that you were moving into a new world quite irrespective of what politicians did with the world. It had changed. It had changed at the level of individual relationships, just as much as it appeared to be changing on the level of political relationships.
I think anything like a war does create an inevitable upheaval in people's personal relationships. Marriages in which people are separated for a long time run very great risks.
How long do you think this blasted war is going on for?
Oh, years and years and years, I should think. Spring 1950 is my personal bet.
Do you think any of us have the right to get ourselves tangled up until it's over?
What do you mean, financially or emotionally?
Wives, children, things like that.
Why ask me, old man? Personally, I've never had the old urge. Why don't you write to Auntie Thingamajig in the Daily What's-It?
I'm serious, you know.
I know you are.
People who are separated and lonely and in danger, they may form other relationships just simply out of the need for companionship and love in a situation in their lives when they feel that each day may be their last.
And so there's a great deal of live for the day and ignore the conventions. As the statistics themselves tell us, there was an enormous increase, for instance, in the incidence of venereal disease. There was an increase in illegitimate births. There was an increase in the divorce rate as people got married quickly and then found that they were incompatible. This caused great problems and concern to the authorities, to church authorities, to moralists of various kinds, who felt that the family would break down under the weight of these sexual changes. As it happens, they didn't. In one sense, the family was reinforced by having been put under stress, because there are other ties besides those of sex. There are emotional ties and familial ties, and families were, in a sense, strengthened, if you like, by the furnace of war.
Outside the family, in the wider context of everyday life, the war had brought us together as members of the same society in quite new ways and with heightened consciousness.
The British, in wartime, were a community sustained by good humour and fortitude and communality, and that this was the period when, if you like, for the first time in British history, strangers talked to each other on trains, and people were always willing to turn up with a cup of tea for people who were in difficulty. There was enormous communality during the war.
I think the war really emphasized the inequalities of the old world, the us and the them. I don't know that we've rooted out the us and the thems yet, but I do think that was emphasized. And when you were fighting side by side, all classes and all people, I think you realized that this is how things must move in the future. The people must work for peace together. And that you were wanting to rebuild a better world. I mean, I know it sounded vague. We weren't quite sure what it was. But you felt it as you came home in a train full of soldiers, and you could hear them talking, and what they wanted was to start life again with hope of jobs, of health, of families above all, and setting up a home in a peaceful world.
I think that what happened was that people of different classes got to know other people of different classes in the shelters and in the home guard and in the forces for the first time, and they got to understand them and sympathise with them all. So they were no longer like a foreign tribe, a different group they knew nothing of. But it didn't mean that the class system was abolished.
Class changes in Britain resulting from the war have persisted to this day, though other achievements, dreams and visions have been modified by time or passed away altogether. Picture post has long since vanished from the newsstands. Agricultural sufficiency has turned into farming surpluses. Some of the great industries nationalised in the 40s to secure for the government the commanding heights have now gone back into private hands. That's the way of life. Indeed, change is now more than ever an inescapable part of life, and perhaps the war of 50 years ago had a lot to do with that. But what was its enduring legacy?
If it hadn't been for World War II, I think that many of the changes that took place in the late 40s would have been spread over about 20 years.
What the war did was pose new challenges, new problems, new tests, and in rising to these challenges, meeting these new tests, British society was transformed in some ways, in bad ways, in some ways, in good ways.
The fresh air came in to the British thinking, that you did share things, you did plan your resources. Above all, the conception of solidarity underlying the welfare state. You organise your lives in a sensible way, so when people are up against it, they get the help they need. And then they darn well make their contribution when they're fit and well. And that is still, in my view, running deeply in the British people, and that is directly a product of the Second World War.
I think the things that came out of the war that were productive were social and cultural, and the things that came out of the war that were, if you like, negative, were economic, largely. Britain had fought and carried on fighting and had spent enormous amounts, not only of human lives, but of money, and by the end of the war was bankrupt, and it could no longer sustain the enormous effort of holding down an empire, particularly when that empire was proving more and more fractious. The war marks the end, effectively, of the British Empire as a viable entity.
Perhaps, in many respects, the war was more of an accelerator of change than a catalyst. But at its very end came the event which vastly overshadowed all the technical developments of the wartime years, the dropping of the atomic bomb. In the heat of war, man had mastered the atom, the supreme but awesome achievement of our entire century.
The harnessing of nuclear energy, the energy of the sun and the stars to men's needs, is the greatest conquest they have ever made, far greater than agriculture or fire or steam. But great as it is, it's only a symbol of what men can do, and know they can do, in all fields of endeavour.
Professor J.D. Burnell, the eminent scientist, broadcasting early in 1946 on the great issues of our time.
The methods of organised research and development, which have grown over many years and were tried out and perfected during the war, have put into our hands powers which are literally unlimited. The major fact we must now face is that with these powers, man must now, for the first time, accept the responsibility for running his own world in a sensible way.
So the post-war years found us in possession of physical powers undreamt of in pre-war days, and with a potential which even now we only dimly perceive. But human values remain supremely important even in the nuclear age. They will always be closer to home for us all. And my own opinion is that in these vital terms, our society emerged from the conflict of war more considerate, more decent, and more generous. The quality of life was greatly heightened. There was no going back to those bad old days. There was a new spirit abroad in the land after this war, and in my book that spirit still persists to a greater degree than many recognise who've no personal memories of pre-war Britain. The war was not fought in vain.
No Going Back was presented by Frank Gillard and produced by Rosemary, Hart and Mark Savage.